Welcome, I'm John, and today I'm going to tell you an exciting story. Millionaire ignores poor cleaning lady, but discovers something that makes him fall to his knees. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing the 63rd floor of the WALLACE Tower, a kingdom of glass and cold ambition suspended above the chaos of Manhattan. Richard Wallace stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the city below like a general observing conquered territory. The sunset bled orange across the skyline, but he didn't notice. Beauty had no value in his ledger. His phone buzzed. Another deal closed. Another competitor crushed. Another million added to an empire already worth billions. Richard's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough for a man who'd forgotten how. "Mr. Wallace, the quarterly reports are ready for your review." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and efficient, just as he preferred. "Leave them on my desk," he replied without turning. "And remind security, no interruptions after 7. I don't care who it is." The office fell silent again. Richard liked it that way. Silence meant control. Silence meant no complications, no messy emotions clouding judgment. He'd built his empire on calculated decisions, not sentiment. His ex-wife had learned that the hard way. So had his former business partners. So had anyone foolish enough to believe Richard Wallace had room in his life for anything beyond profit margins and market dominance. He settled into his leather chair, the reports spread before him like cards in a winning hand. The numbers were good. They were always good. Yet lately, something gnawed at the edges of his satisfaction. A hollow echo he couldn't quite silence with another acquisition. At 7:15, he heard it. The soft click of the service entrance opening. The gentle rustle of a cleaning cart being wheeled across marble floors. Richard didn't look up. He never did. The cleaning staff were part of the building's infrastructure, as invisible as the ventilation system and just as noticed. Jessica Miller pushed her cart through the penthouse, her movements practiced and economical. She'd been cleaning this office for 3 years, long enough to know every corner, every surface, every habit of the man who owned it. Long enough to become a ghost. Her shoulders ached. They always did by this point in the day. The restaurant shift had run late, and she'd barely made it to her afternoon cleaning job at the hotel before rushing here. 3 jobs, 7 days a week. And still, the medical bills multiplied like a curse she couldn't break. She moved through the living area first. Not that it looked lived in. The white leather furniture sat pristine and untouched, like a showroom display. No photographs on the shelves. No books left open on the coffee table. No evidence that a human being actually occupied this space. Jessica had seen luxury before, but this was different. This was wealth without warmth, success without soul. In the kitchen, she wiped down counters that hadn't been used. She emptied a trash can that contained only a single coffee cup. She watered plants that seemed as lonely as she felt. And through it all, Richard Wallace remained in his office, a silhouette against the darkening sky, as unaware of her presence as he was of the stars beginning to appear above the city. Jessica paused at the threshold of his office. Protocol said she should wait until he left, but he often worked until midnight, and she had to catch the last bus back to the Bronx. She had to relieve Mrs. Chen, who watched Emily after school. She had to check her daughter's temperature, administer her medication, read her a story, even though Emily was growing too tired to stay awake through the endings anymore. She knocked softly. "Excuse me, Mr. Wallace, may I clean your office?" He waved a hand without looking up, a gesture of dismissal that somehow also granted permission. Jessica wheeled her cart inside, making herself even smaller than usual, if that were possible. She worked around him in silence, emptying his trash, dusting shelves lined with awards he probably never looked at. But as she approached his desk to wipe down the surface, something caught her eye. A photograph, partially hidden beneath a stack of contracts. Old. Faded. The kind people kept not for display but for reasons even they might not fully understand. Jessica's hand froze, her cleaning cloth suspended in midair. The woman in the photograph was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and eyes that held secrets. She wore a summer dress and a hesitant smile, standing in what looked like Central Park, and beside her, younger but unmistakable, was Richard Wallace, his arm around her waist, his expression softer than Jessica had ever imagined possible. But it wasn't Richard who stole Jessica's breath. It was the woman, the face she'd seen only once before, In a single photograph her foster mother had given her on her 18th birthday. The face of the mother who'd abandoned her as an infant, leaving nothing but a name and a mystery. The cloth slipped from Jessica's fingers, landing soundlessly on the carpet. "Are you finished?" Richard's voice cut through her shock, impatient and cold. "Yes, sir," Jessica whispered, her voice strange in her own ears. "I'm finished." She gathered her supplies with shaking hands and left, pulling the cart behind her like a weight. But as the elevator doors closed and the penthouse disappeared above her, Jessica knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Nothing was finished. Everything was just beginning. The bus lurched through the dark streets of the Bronx, its fluorescent lights flickering like a dying heartbeat. Jessica pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the city blur past. Bodegas with barred windows, flickering streetlights, shadows huddled in doorways against the October chill. But she saw none of it. Her mind remained trapped 63 floors above Manhattan, in an office that smelled of leather and expensive cologne, staring at a photograph that had shattered her understanding of everything. Her mother, Richard Wallace, together. The questions came in waves, each one pulling her deeper into confusion. How did they know each other? Why had her mother never mentioned him? And the most terrifying question of all, the one she barely dared to form, could Richard Wallace be her father? Jessica's hands trembled as she clutched her worn purse. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper she'd saved from a gift she'd received years ago, was her only photograph of her mother. She'd looked at it 1,000 times, memorizing every detail of a woman she'd never known. A woman who'd left her at a fire station wrapped in a yellow blanket with nothing but a note. "Her name is Jessica. Please give her the life I can't." The bus screeched to a stop. Jessica climbed off, her body moving on autopilot through familiar streets. 3 blocks to her apartment building, a narrow walk-up with cracked concrete steps and a front door that never quite closed properly. Mrs. Chen was already waiting in the hallway, her kind face creased with concern. "She had a rough evening," Mrs. Chen said softly, gathering her knitting into a canvas bag. "Fever spiked around 6. I gave her the medication, but Jessica, you should call the doctor tomorrow." Jessica's heart clenched. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd manage. You always do." The older woman squeezed Jessica's hand. "That's what worries me." Inside the small apartment, Emily lay curled on the couch under 3 blankets despite the radiator's hissing warmth. Her daughter's face looked smaller somehow, more fragile than it had that morning. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her breathing came shallow and quick. Jessica knelt beside her, pressing a kiss to Emily's fevered forehead. "Hey, baby, how are you feeling?" Emily's eyes fluttered open, and despite everything, she smiled. "Hi, Mama. Did you see any fancy people today?" It was their game. Emily loved hearing stories about the world her mother cleaned, the glimpses of lives so different from their own. Jessica usually invented cheerful tales, painting pictures of kindness that rarely existed. But tonight, the words stuck in her throat. "Not tonight, sweetheart, but I'll tell you tomorrow, okay? You need to rest. Will you stay with me? Always." Jessica settled onto the floor beside the couch, her back against the worn cushions, and held her daughter's small hand. She waited until Emily's breathing deepened into sleep before allowing herself to cry. Silent tears that tracked down her cheeks and dripped onto her work uniform. The medical bills sat on the kitchen table like accusations. $47,000 and climbing. The experimental treatment Emily needed wasn't covered by their bare-bones insurance. Jessica had applied for assistance programs, started a crowdfunding campaign that had raised barely $3,000, even sold everything of value she owned. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. And now this impossible revelation that the man whose floors she scrubbed, whose trash she emptied, whose existence barely registered her presence, this man might be her father. Jessica pulled out her photograph, studying it in the dim light. Her mother couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. Young, beautiful, frightened, if you looked closely enough at the tension around her eyes. What had happened between this photograph and the moment she'd left an infant at a fire station? What had Richard Wallace done, or not done, that had led to that desperate choice? The anger came then, hot and fierce. If Richard was her father, he'd abandoned her. He'd let her grow up in foster care, bouncing between families who saw her as a paycheck or a burden. He'd never searched for her, never wondered about the daughter he might have left behind. He'd built his empire while she'd fought for scraps. But Emily coughed in her sleep, a wet, painful sound that cut through Jessica's rage. and replaced it with something more complex. Desperation mixed with pride, hope tangled with fear. Richard Wallace had resources that could save Emily's life, but asking him, if he even was her father, would mean revealing herself, making herself vulnerable to a man who'd spent years looking through her like she was made of glass. Jessica returned the photograph to her purse and pulled a small notebook from the kitchen drawer. Inside were fragments she'd collected over the years, her mother's full name from her birth certificate, the name of the hospital where she was born, dates that had never quite added up. She'd stopped investigating long ago, the dead ends too painful, the answers too elusive. But now she had a thread, a connection, a photograph that linked her past to a present she'd never imagined. She opened her laptop, an ancient machine that took 5 minutes to start, and began to search. Richard Wallace's history, her mother's name, New York in the 1990s. The pieces were scattered, but somewhere in the darkness there had to be light. Emily stirred, whimpering softly. Jessica closed the laptop and returned to her daughter's side, stroking her hair until she settled back into restless sleep. "I'll figure this out," Jessica whispered into the darkness. "I promise." Outside, the city hummed with endless motion, but in their small apartment, time seemed suspended, caught between a past Jessica had never known and a future she couldn't yet see. The morning came too soon, dragging Jessica from a sleep that had been more anxiety than rest. Emily's fever had broken sometime before dawn, leaving her daughter pale but peaceful. Jessica prepared oatmeal they couldn't afford to waste, and watched Emily pick at it with the appetite of a bird. "Mama, why do you look sad?" Emily asked, her voice small and raspy. Jessica forced a smile, tucking a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I'm not sad, baby. Just tired. You know how it is. You're always tired." It wasn't an accusation, just a fact observed by a child who'd learned to read her mother's exhaustion like other kids read storybooks. After dropping Emily at school, ignoring the concerned look from her teacher, Miss Patterson, who'd noticed how often Emily visited the nurse's office, Jessica headed to her morning shift at the diner. Her mind churned through the previous night's research, fragments of information that created more questions than answers. Richard Wallace, 54, self-made billionaire, real estate mogul, no children listed in any public record, divorced twice, no current relationships, known for his ruthlessness in business and his absence from social circles, a man who'd built walls higher than his towers, and her mother, Catherine Brooks, who'd died in a car accident when Jessica was 3, no other family listed, no connections to explain how a young woman from nowhere had ended up in a photograph with a man who would become one of New York's most powerful figures. "Jessica, order up!" The diner manager's shout pulled her back to reality. She grabbed the plates, delivered them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and pocketed a $5 tip that would buy Emily's medication for 2 days. Her phone buzzed during her break. A text from the hospital billing department, marked urgent. Jessica deleted it without reading. She knew what it said. They all said the same thing. That evening, as she prepared for her shift at Richard's penthouse, Jessica made a decision. She would look for more evidence. Letters, documents, anything that might confirm or deny the suspicion that had taken root in her chest like a tumor. She wasn't ready to confront him, not yet, maybe never, but she needed to know the truth. The penthouse was empty when she arrived, which wasn't unusual. Richard often worked late at his downtown office on Wednesdays. Jessica moved through her routine with mechanical precision, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached his study. She'd never searched his private spaces before. The thought went against everything she believed about dignity and respect. But desperation rewrites the rules we live by, and Emily's labored breathing had become a clock counting down to decisions Jessica never thought she'd have to make. The desk drawers were locked, but the filing cabinet in the corner wasn't. Jessica's hands shook as she opened it, half expecting alarms to sound, security to appear. But there was only silence and the whisper of her conscience telling her to stop. The files were organized by year, meticulous and color-coded. She started with the 1990s, pulling folders with careful fingers, looking for anything. A name, a date, a clue. Most contained property deeds, investment records, the paper trail of wealth accumulation. Then, in a folder marked Personal 1994, she found it. A letter, handwritten on paper yellowed with age. The handwriting was feminine, elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time or tears or both. "Richard, I'm writing this because I don't have the courage to say it to your face. I'm pregnant. I know what you'll say, that we agreed this was temporary, that your career comes first, that a child doesn't fit into your plans. You're right, it doesn't fit into mine either. But I can't do what you suggested. I won't. So I'm making this easy for both of us. I'm leaving New York. You'll never hear from me again. You can build your empire without the complication of a family you never wanted. Don't try to find me. Don't try to fix this. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. Catherine Jessica's vision blurred. The letter slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a falling leaf. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sob that wanted to break free. He'd known. Richard Wallace had known about her existence, or at least about her mother's pregnancy, and he'd done nothing. Worse than nothing. He'd suggested Catherine do something about it, a euphemism that made Jessica's stomach turn. Her mother had run to protect her, to give her life, even if she couldn't give her much else. And Richard had let them disappear, relieved to be free of the inconvenience. The anger that flooded through Jessica was pure and terrible. This man, this cold, calculating man who lived in a palace while his daughter scrubbed his floors, had chosen his ambition over her life before she'd even drawn her first breath. She picked up the letter with trembling hands, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. Evidence. Proof. A weapon she didn't yet know how to use. The sound of the elevator arriving sent panic shooting through her veins. Jessica shoved the folder back into the cabinet, closed it as quietly as possible, and grabbed her cleaning supplies. By the time Richard walked through the door, she was dusting the bookshelf in the living room, her face a mask of calm professionalism, her heart a war drum beating against her ribs. Richard barely glanced at her as he passed, loosening his tie, his phone pressed to his ear. I don't care about their concerns. Tell them it's my way or they can find another investor. Jessica watched him disappear into his bedroom. This man who was her father and a stranger, who held her daughter's life in his hands without knowing it, who'd thrown away his own child like a bad investment. She finished her work in a daze and left without saying goodbye to someone who'd never bothered to say hello. On the bus home, Jessica pulled out the letter and read it again under the flickering lights. Each word was a confirmation and a condemnation. She had her answer now. The question was, what would she do with it? The letter burned in Jessica's pocket like a brand, its presence impossible to ignore even as she went through the motions of her life. 3 days passed in a fog of routine and rage. Diner shifts where she smiled at customers who didn't see her. Hotel rooms she cleaned while rehearsing conversations she'd never have. Evenings at the penthouse where she and Richard existed in the same space like strangers in an elevator. Close but worlds apart. Emily's condition worsened. The fever returned with a vengeance, and with it came new symptoms that terrified Jessica. Bruising that appeared without cause, fatigue so profound that her daughter could barely lift her head from the pillow. Dr. Morrison, the pediatric oncologist at Mount Sinai, had been blunt during their last appointment. We're running out of time, Ms. Miller. Without the treatment, I give her 6 months, maybe less. 6 months. The words haunted Jessica's dreams and poisoned her waking hours. 6 months to watch her daughter fade. 6 months to fail at the one thing that mattered, unless she did something unthinkable. On Friday evening, Jessica stood outside the WALLACE Tower longer than usual, staring up at the 63rd floor where light blazed against the darkening sky. In her purse, the letter waited alongside her carefully rehearsed words. She would tell him. Tonight. She would walk into that penthouse, place the letter on his desk, and watch his face as he realized the invisible woman who cleaned his floors was the daughter he'd discarded before she was born. And then she would ask him to save Emily. The thought made her sick with shame and desperation in equal measure. Her pride, the only thing poverty hadn't stolen, recoiled at the idea of begging this man for anything. But pride couldn't cure cancer. Pride couldn't pay for experimental treatments. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Jessica rode the elevator up with her stomach in knots. When the doors opened, she found Richard in his usual position, standing at the windows, surveying his kingdom. But something was different tonight. His shoulders were tense, his posture less commanding. When he turned, Jessica saw exhaustion carved into his face, aging him beyond his years. "You're late," he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "I apologize, Mr. Wallace. The bus was delayed." Jessica's voice came out steadier than she felt. She pushed her cart inside, her hand unconsciously moving to the letter in her pocket. "Leave it," Richard said suddenly. Jessica froze. "Sir?" "The cleaning. Leave it for tonight." He moved to the bar and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, drained it, poured another. Have you ever built something for so long that you forgot why you started? The question caught Jessica off guard. In 3 years, Richard had never addressed her directly beyond basic instructions. Now he stood there, drink in hand, actually looking at her for what might have been the first time. I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Wallace. No, I suppose you wouldn't. He laughed, bitter and hollow. Why would you? You're just the cleaning woman. You come, you clean, you leave. You don't care about stock prices or board meetings or empires that crumble while you watch. Jessica's anger flared. You're right. I don't care about those things. I care about keeping a roof over my daughter's head. I care about her next meal, her medication, whether she'll live to see her next birthday. The words escaped before she could stop them, raw and unfiltered. Richard's eyes focused on her, really seeing her for the first time, and Jessica realized she'd broken the invisible rule that kept people like her safely in the background. You have a daughter? Richard's voice softened, something almost human flickering across his features. Yes. Jessica's throat tightened. This wasn't how she'd planned it, but the moment had arrived whether she was ready or not. She's 9, and she's dying. Richard set down his glass. I'm sorry. Are you? The question came out sharper than Jessica intended. Are you really? What kind of question is that? Jessica's hand moved to her purse. She could feel the letter's edges through the fabric, angular and damning. This was it, the moment of truth that would either save Emily or destroy what little remained of Jessica's dignity. But before she could speak, Richard's phone erupted with sound. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. I have to take this, he answered, his voice tight. What do you mean the SEC is investigating? That's impossible. I've done everything by the book. He walked away, his conversation dissolving into heated whispers and barely controlled panic. Jessica watched him pace, watched his empire begin its collapse in real time, and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. When he hung up 15 minutes later, Richard looked like a man who'd seen his future and found it empty. Bad news? Jessica asked quietly. The worst. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. 30 years of building, and it could all disappear because of one bad investment, one trusted partner who turned out to be a fraud. They're calling it insider trading. They're going to destroy me. Jessica should have felt vindicated. This was karma, justice for a man who'd thrown away his own child. But watching him break, she felt only a hollow ache. Revenge, she realized, was supposed to feel better than this. Mr. Wallace, she said softly, there's something I need to tell you. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a fraction of a second, Jessica saw something in his face. A shadow, a ghost of recognition, as if some part of him already knew what she was about to say. But then his phone rang again, and the moment shattered. I have to go, Richard said, standing abruptly. Emergency board meeting. Stay as long as you need. Lock up when you're finished. He grabbed his coat and was gone, leaving Jessica alone in the penthouse with her confession unspoken and the letter still hidden in her purse. She stood there for a long moment, suspended between relief and disappointment. Then she pulled out the letter, walked to his desk, and placed it face up where he couldn't miss it. Beneath it, she left a note on a cleaning receipt, her handwriting small and precise. Mr. Wallace, we need to talk. Jessica Miller. Then she left, the weight of the letter finally lifted from her shoulders but replaced by the terrifying uncertainty of what would come next. Jessica didn't sleep that night. She lay in the darkness of her small bedroom, listening to Emily's labored breathing through the thin wall, and imagined a dozen different scenarios. Richard reading the letter with cold indifference. Richard throwing it away without a second glance. Richard calling security to have her fired and blacklisted from every cleaning service in Manhattan. Or worse, Richard reading it and simply not caring. By morning, her phone remained silent. No calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that her entire world had shifted on its axis. Jessica went through her Saturday routine like a sleepwalker. Emily's medication, breakfast neither of them could finish, cartoons playing to an audience of one while Jessica stared at her phone, willing it to ring. At noon, Mrs. Chen knocked softly and entered with a container of soup. You look terrible, Mija. When did you last eat? I'm fine, Jessica lied, accepting the soup she wouldn't taste. Just tired. You're always tired. Mrs. Chen settled beside Emily on the couch, feeling her forehead with practiced concern. This fever isn't breaking like it should. Have you called the doctor? I have an appointment Monday. Another lie. She'd canceled it because she couldn't afford the copay and couldn't bear to hear Dr. Morrison's increasingly dire predictions. Her phone buzzed. Jessica's heart lurched, but it was just a reminder about an overdue electric bill. She set it down with shaking hands. Jessica. Mrs. Chen's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much hardship to accept easy deflections. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. But she did. She always had. That was the mathematics of poverty and single motherhood. Addition by subtraction, survival by isolation, strength measured in how much you could endure before breaking. The call came at 4:17 that afternoon. Unknown number. Jessica's finger hovered over the decline button before something made her answer. Ms. Miller? A woman's voice, professional and crisp. This is Sarah Chen, executive assistant to Richard Wallace. Mr. Wallace requests a meeting with you tomorrow, Sunday, at 2 p.m., at his penthouse. He asks that you come alone. Jessica's mouth went dry. Yes, I'll be there. Excellent. The doorman will be expecting you. A pause, then softer. Ms. Miller, bring your daughter. The line went dead before Jessica could ask what that meant. Sunday arrived wrapped in gray November clouds that threatened rain. Jessica dressed Emily in her best outfit, a purple dress from the thrift store, slightly too big but clean and pressed. Her daughter's excitement at missing school and going on an adventure to Manhattan broke Jessica's heart in new ways. Are we going somewhere fancy, Mama? Sort of, baby. We're going to meet someone. Someone nice? Jessica had no answer for that. The Wallace Towers lobby was different on Sundays. Quieter, emptier, the usual bustle of business replaced by an almost cathedral-like silence. The doorman checked his list and gestured toward the private elevator, the one Jessica had only seen Richard use. 63rd floor. He's expecting you. The elevator rose with mechanical smoothness, and Emily pressed her face to the glass wall, watching the city shrink beneath them. Mama, we're flying. We are, sweetheart. We really are. The doors opened directly into the penthouse. Richard stood at the windows, his back to them, shoulders rigid with tension. He turned slowly, and Jessica saw a night's worth of sleeplessness etched into his face. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They moved from Jessica to Emily and back again, and something in them cracked open. Ms. Miller, he said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. Thank you for coming. Emily pressed against Jessica's leg, suddenly shy. Jessica rested a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Mr. Wallace, this is my daughter Emily. Emily, say hello. Hello, Emily whispered, peeking out from behind her mother. Richard's composure wavered. He crossed the room and knelt down to Emily's eye level, a gesture so unexpected that Jessica felt her defenses weaken. Hello, Emily. It's very nice to meet you. How old are you? 9. I'll be 10 in March. Emily paused. If I'm still here? The innocent statement landed like a bomb. Richard's face went pale. He looked up at Jessica, and she saw the question there, the horror and dawning understanding. She's sick, Jessica said quietly. Very sick. Richard stood slowly, pulling a familiar piece of yellowed paper from his jacket pocket. The letter. Catherine's letter. His hand trembled as he held it. I read this last night. I've read it 100 times since. His voice broke. And I read your note. Jessica Miller. I never knew your last name. In 3 years, I never even asked. You never looked at me, Jessica said, years of invisibility sharpening her words. Why would you need my name? Because you're my daughter. The words came out like a confession, heavy with weight he'd carried unknowingly for decades. Aren't you? You're Catherine's child. You're mine. Emily looked up at Jessica, confusion clouding her fevered eyes. Mama, what does he mean? Jessica's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Baby, why don't you sit on that nice couch over there? I need to talk to Mr. Wallace for a minute. Emily hesitated, then obeyed, settling into leather that probably cost more than their annual rent. She pulled out a worn stuffed rabbit from her backpack and hugged it close, watching them with solemn eyes too old for her face. Richard and Jessica stood facing each other, a lifetime of absence between them. Catherine left when she was pregnant. Richard said, I didn't know if she kept the baby. I didn't know if it survived. I told myself it was better not to know. Easier. He laughed, bitter and broken. God, I've been such a coward. You suggested she get rid of it, Jessica said, pulling out the letter, pointing to the damning lines. You told her a child didn't fit your plans. I was 28 and terrified. I was building something from nothing, working 20-hour days, drowning in debt and ambition. She was right. I wasn't ready for a family, but that doesn't make what I said forgivable. No, Jessica agreed coldly. It doesn't. Richard looked at Emily, then back at Jessica. and something fundamental shifted in his expression. "She has Catherine's eyes, and she has your strength. I can see it, even from here. Her strength is running out." Jessica's voice cracked. "She needs treatment I can't afford. She needs a miracle I can't give her. And I hate myself for coming here. I hate that I have to ask you who threw us away before I was born, to save her life." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were wet. "You shouldn't have to ask," he said quietly. "What does she need?" The question hung between them. What does she need? And for a moment, Jessica couldn't speak. She'd imagined this conversation 1,000 times, rehearsed it in the shower, in the bus, in the sleepless hours before dawn. But now, faced with the reality of it, the words lodged in her throat like stones. "Everything," she finally whispered. "She needs everything." Richard pulled out his phone, his businessman's instinct taking over. "Give me the details. Her diagnosis, her doctor's name, the treatment plan." Jessica fumbled in her purse, producing a folder she'd carried like a talisman. Medical records, bills stamped overdue in angry red letters. Dr. Morrison's treatment proposal that might as well have been written in gold for all its accessibility. Her hands shook as she handed it over. Richard flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each one. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, stage 3. Jesus Christ." He looked up at Emily, who was singing softly to her stuffed rabbit, oblivious to the adults negotiating her survival. "And this treatment at Johns Hopkins, they say it has an 80% success rate if we start within the next month." After that, Jessica couldn't finish the sentence. "How much?" $230,000, plus ongoing care, travel expenses, lodging near the hospital. The social worker estimated $300,000 total. The numbers felt obscene, spoken aloud. A ransom for a life that shouldn't have a price tag. Richard pulled out his phone and dialed. "Marcus, I need you to wire $350,000 to..." He looked at Jessica expectantly. She stared at him, unable to process what was happening. I don't have an account that can hold that much." "Then we'll open one." "Marcus, hold on." Richard lowered the phone. "We'll set up a medical trust for Emily. All expenses covered, no questions asked. You'll have access to whatever you need." Jessica's knees weakened. She reached for the wall to steady herself. "I can't." "Why would you?" "Because she's your daughter." Richard's voice roughened. "And you're mine. That makes her my granddaughter. That makes her family." He paused, something fragile entering his expression. "That makes her the only family I have left." The word, family, sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Jessica wanted to rage at him, to throw his sudden generosity back in his face. Where was this man when she was 7 and sleeping in a car with her 3rd foster family? Where was he when she aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a bus ticket to nowhere? But Emily coughed, a wet, painful sound, and Jessica's anger dissolved into something more complicated. Resentment and relief tangled together, pride warring with desperation. "I need to know something first," Jessica said quietly. "Did you ever look for her? For my mother? After she left?" Richard set down the folder, his shoulders sagging. "No, I was angry at first. Felt betrayed, even though I had no right. Then I buried myself in work, told myself she'd made her choice and I'd made mine. It was easier than admitting I was a coward. She died when I was 3. Car accident on a rainy night in Newark. They said she fell asleep at the wheel." Jessica's voice remained flat, reciting facts that had haunted her entire life. She was working 2 jobs, probably exhausted, probably desperate, probably alone. Richard flinched as if she'd struck him. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." The truth of it settled over them like ash. Emily had abandoned her rabbit and was exploring the penthouse with cautious wonder, running her small fingers along the white leather furniture, staring at the enormous television, pressing her face against the windows to watch the city sprawl beneath her. "Mama, look, I can see the whole world from here." Jessica's heart clenched. Her daughter, who might not live to see her 10th birthday, marveling at a view that men like Richard took for granted. The injustice of it, the sheer brutal unfairness, made her want to scream. Richard watched Emily too, and something in his face crumbled. What's her favorite thing? What makes her happy? The question surprised Jessica. Books. She loves stories. Fairy tales especially. The ones where the princess saves herself. A sad smile touched her lips. And stars. She's obsessed with stars, even though we can barely see them in the Bronx. Does she know about... Richard gestured vaguely between them. About you being her grandfather? No. She just knows you're someone who might help. Jessica's voice hardened. I won't lie to her, but I also won't force a relationship that might disappear the moment it becomes inconvenient for you. That's fair, Richard said quietly. More than fair. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and grimaced. My lawyer. The SEC investigation. They're escalating. There's going to be a media circus tomorrow. My face will be all over the news and not in a good way. I'm sorry, Jessica said, and meant it despite everything. Don't be. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe this is karma finally catching up. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. But Emily doesn't deserve what she's facing. Neither do you. So regardless of what happens to me, to my company, to my reputation, that money is yours. The trust is ironclad. Even if I end up in prison, she gets her treatment. Jessica felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what else to say. Don't thank me. Not yet. Let her get better first. Then maybe. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. Emily returned, her face flushed with excitement and fever. Mama, can we come back here sometime? It's like a castle. Jessica knelt down, pulling her daughter close. Maybe, baby. We'll see. Richard crouched beside them, maintaining a respectful distance but unable to hide the longing in his eyes. Emily, your mother tells me you like stories. What's your favorite? Emily's face lit up despite her exhaustion. Beauty and the Beast, because the beast becomes good at the end. People can change if they try. Richard's composure finally broke. A single tear tracked down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. Yes, he said hoarsely. Yes, they can. Jessica gathered Emily's things, preparing to leave. At the elevator, she turned back. Richard stood framed by his windows and his wealth, looking smaller somehow, more human. Mr. Wallace? Richard, please. Call me Richard. Jessica nodded slowly. Richard, I meant what I said. I won't force anything. But if you want to be part of her life, part of our lives, you have to actually be present. Not just with money, but with time, with effort, with the things that matter. I understand. He paused. And Jessica, I know I have no right to ask, but may I visit her before the treatment starts? I'd like to get to know my granddaughter, if that's okay with you. Jessica looked at Emily, who was already half asleep against her shoulder, then back at Richard. 34 years of abandonment warred with the desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, something good could come from this wreckage. We'll see, she said finally, one day at a time. The elevator doors closed on Richard's nod, and as they descended from his castle in the sky, Jessica held her daughter close and let herself believe, just for a moment, in fairy tales where beasts became human and happy endings were possible. The medical trust appeared in Jessica's account by Monday morning, a number so large it didn't seem real, like a typo in the universe's ledger. She stared at her phone screen in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room, refreshing the banking app 3 times to confirm it wasn't a dream. Dr. Morrison emerged from his office, and for the first time in months, Jessica met his eyes without the weight of impossible debt crushing her shoulders. We can do the treatment, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We can start whenever you're ready. The doctor's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine relief. Ms. Miller, that's wonderful news. I'll contact Johns Hopkins immediately. With Emily's current condition, I'd recommend we begin within the week. A week. 7 days between this moment and hope. Jessica nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. Emily's admission to Johns Hopkins happened with startling speed. The kind of efficiency money bought, Jessica realized with bitter irony. The hospital in Baltimore was nothing like the overcrowded, understaffed public clinics she'd grown accustomed to. Here, nurses smiled and had time to answer questions. Doctors explained treatments in detail rather than rushing to the next crisis. Emily's room had windows that overlooked a garden, not a parking lot. Mama, is this real? Emily whispered on their first night, nestled in a bed that adjusted with the push of a button. An IV delivering medications that cost more per hour than Jessica used to make in a week. It's real, baby. You're going to get better. Because of that man? The one from the castle? Jessica smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. Yes, because of him. Is he a good person? The question hung in the sterile air. Jessica thought of Richard standing in his empty penthouse, the loneliness radiating off him like cold. She thought of Catherine's letter, of 34 years of absence. She thought of the way he'd looked at Emily, with wonder and regret and something that might have been love. "I think he's trying to be," Jessica said finally. "Sometimes that's the best people can do." Richard called every evening at 7. The first few conversations were awkward, stilted, two strangers connected by blood and circumstance, fumbling toward something that resembled family. He asked about Emily's treatments, her appetite, her spirits. He asked about Jessica's needs. Was the hotel comfortable? Did she have enough money for meals? Did she need anything? "Why are you doing this?" Jessica asked on the 4th night, exhausted from another day of watching poison dripped into her daughter's veins in the hope it would kill what was killing her. "Because I should have done it 34 years ago," Richard replied. "Because I owe Catherine a debt I can never repay. Because I look at Emily and see all the moments I missed with you." His voice cracked. "Because I'm tired of being alone with my money and my regrets." In New York, Richard's world was collapsing with spectacular publicity. The SEC investigation dominated headlines. Business partners distanced themselves. The board voted to remove him as CEO pending the investigation's outcome. His empire, built over 30 years, crumbled in 30 days. But every evening at 7, he called Baltimore. And every Saturday, he made the drive, 3.5 hours each way, to sit in Emily's hospital room and read to her from books he'd purchased at the hospital gift shop, with an abandon that spoke of a man who'd forgotten how to do anything that wasn't a transaction. Emily responded to him with the easy acceptance of children who hadn't yet learned to hold grudges. She taught him the names of her stuffed animals. She asked him to draw stars on her sketches because his were more pointy. She fell asleep during his readings and woke to find him still there, book closed, watching her with an expression Jessica had learned to recognize, wonder mixed with grief for all the time already lost. Jessica watched their relationship unfold with complicated emotions. Part of her resented how easily Emily welcomed Richard, how quickly she forgave what she didn't even know needed forgiving. But a larger part, the part that had always been a daughter searching for a father, felt something soften inside her chest. One Saturday afternoon, while Emily napped between treatments, Richard and Jessica sat in the hospital cafeteria, nursing terrible coffee. "The prosecution is pushing for a trial," Richard said quietly, stirring his cup without drinking. "My lawyers say I could face 5 years if convicted. Probably less, given my age and lack of criminal history. But still," he laughed hollowly, 30 years building an empire, and I'll be remembered as a criminal." "Are you guilty?" Jessica asked bluntly. "Not of what they're accusing me of, but guilty of plenty else." He met her eyes. "I was so focused on winning that I stopped seeing people as people. They were resources, obstacles, tools. Catherine tried to tell me. She said I was becoming hollow. I told her she didn't understand ambition. She understood," Jessica said softly. "She just understood the cost, too." "I wish I'd listened." Richard set down his untouched coffee. "I wish I'd chosen differently. But wishes don't change the past, do they?" "No, but choices change the future." They sat in silence, two people connected by blood and broken by circumstance, learning to exist in the same space without the walls that had divided them. That evening, Emily's fever spiked, a side effect of the chemotherapy, the nurses assured them, but terrifying nonetheless. Jessica held her daughter's hand while she shook with chills despite the blankets piled on her small frame. Richard paced the hallway, making calls to specialists, demanding consultations, his businessman's fury focused on an enemy he couldn't intimidate or buy off. When Emily finally stabilized near midnight, Richard collapsed into the chair beside Jessica, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully maintained facade shattered. "I can't lose her," he whispered. "I just found her. I can't lose her too." Jessica looked at this man, her father, and saw past his wealth and his failures to the frightened human underneath. She reached out and took his hand. He gripped it like a lifeline. "Then stay," she said. "Be here. That's all you can do." So he stayed, through the long night and the ones that followed, through the bad days and the slightly better ones, through treatments that made Emily sicker before they made her stronger, through the slow, terrifying, miraculous process of watching a child fight for her life while the adults who loved her learned to fight for each other. And somewhere in those hospital corridors, between crisis and hope, abandonment and presence, 3 broken people began to discover what it meant to be a family, not the one they'd imagined, but the one they'd somehow, impossibly, become. 3 months into treatment, Emily lost her hair. She'd been expecting it. The nurses had prepared her, shown her pictures, offered wigs and hats and scarves in cheerful colors. But when the first clumps came away in Jessica's hands during a gentle brushing, Emily's brave facade crumbled. "I look like a monster," she sobbed, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. "You look like a warrior," Jessica whispered fiercely, holding her daughter close. "Like the strongest person I know." But Emily wouldn't be consoled. She refused to leave her room, refused to see the other children in the pediatric ward, refused even to FaceTime with Mrs. Chen back in New York. She curled into herself, small and defeated, and Jessica felt helpless rage at a universe that demanded so much from someone so young. Richard arrived that Saturday carrying a large box. Emily wouldn't look at him, her bald head buried under blankets. "Emily," he said gently, settling into the chair beside her bed. "I brought you something. May I show you?" Silence. Then, after a long moment, a tiny nod from beneath the covers. Richard opened the box and pulled out a telescope. Not a toy, but a real one. Professional grade. The kind serious astronomers used. "Your mother told me you love stars. I thought maybe we could look at them together. Really look at them, not just the few dim ones we can see from the city." Emily peeked out from the blankets, her eyes red from crying but curious despite herself. "A real telescope? The best money can buy, which, admittedly, is my solution to most problems." Richard's self-deprecating smile was something new, a crack in the armor Jessica had watched him slowly shed over these months. "But in this case, I think it's justified, because tonight is supposed to be clear, and the hospital has a rooftop observation deck, and I happen to know someone who can get us access after visiting hours." "I don't want people to see me," Emily whispered, touching her bare head. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that made both Emily and Jessica catch their breath. He pulled a beanie from his pocket and tugged it over his own head, covering his graying hair completely. "Now we match," he said. "Partners in fashion rebellion. What do you say?" Emily's lips twitched. "You look silly. I look distinguished. There's a difference." He offered his hand. "Come on." "The stars are waiting, and they don't care what we look like. That's the beautiful thing about stars. They shine for everyone the same." That night, on the hospital rooftop under a Baltimore sky clearer than anything visible from New York, Emily looked through her telescope and saw Saturn's rings for the first time. Her gasp of wonder made Richard's eyes glisten. "It's so beautiful," she breathed. "Grandpa, look! You can see the rings!" The word, "Grandpa," landed softly, almost accidentally, but its impact was seismic. Richard froze, and Jessica saw him struggling to maintain composure. Emily didn't seem to notice what she'd said, too absorbed in the cosmos spread before her. "Yes, sweetheart," Richard managed, his voice rough. "Yes, it is." Jessica stood apart, watching her father teach her daughter the names of constellations, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This man who'd been a stranger 6 months ago, who'd thrown away his own child before she was born, was learning to be present. Not perfectly, he still threw money at problems, still sometimes seemed bewildered by emotional complexity, but he was trying. Day after day, mile after mile, he was showing up. The SEC trial began in March. Richard spent weekdays in court defending his reputation and weekends in Baltimore reading to his granddaughter. The media painted him as a ruthless tycoon brought low by greed. They didn't see him falling asleep in hospital chairs or learning to braid the wig Emily sometimes wore, or crying silently in the hospital chapel when he thought no one was watching. Jessica attended the trial on the days Emily's treatment schedule allowed. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched prosecutors tear apart the life Richard had built. His business partners testified against him. His ex-wives gave damaging depositions. The empire crumbled piece by piece, and with it, the man Richard had been. But something else was being built in its place, something smaller, more fragile, infinitely more valuable. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in court, Richard returned to Baltimore defeated. He'd been found guilty on 3 counts of securities fraud. Sentencing was scheduled for May. His lawyers estimated 18 months in a minimum security facility, possibly less with good behavior. "I'm sorry," he said to Jessica as they sat in the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "I wanted to be here for all of it, for her recovery, for learning to be your father. And now, I'll be locked away just when we're finally—" "Stop," Jessica interrupted. "You'll be gone for a while. Then you'll come back. That's not abandonment. That's life being complicated." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "My whole childhood, I imagined my father as either a monster or a saint. It never occurred to me he'd be human, flawed and trying and sometimes failing but still showing up. Richard's eyes met hers. Am I? Showing up every single day that matters? Jessica reached across the table and took his hand. You're here. That's more than I ever expected. More than I thought I wanted. Her voice softened. You're my father. Not the one I dreamed about, but the one I have. And that's enough. Richard broke then. Really broke. Tears streaming down his face unchecked. I don't deserve this. Any of this. Your forgiveness. Emily's love. Probably not, Jessica agreed. But you're getting it anyway. That's what family means. Not perfection, just presence. They sat together in that sterile cafeteria. Two people learning to be father and daughter 34 years late. And it was messy and imperfect and more real than anything Jessica had ever known. Later, back in Emily's room, Richard read from The Little Prince, Emily's current favorite. When he reached the line about the fox and taming, his voice caught, You become responsible, forever, for what you have tamed. Emily was already asleep, her breathing steady for the first time in days. Richard closed the book and looked at Jessica. I failed you once, he said quietly. I won't fail her. Or you. Not again. I know, Jessica said, and she realized with surprise that she meant it. Outside, spring crept toward Baltimore. Inside, against impossible odds and despite terrible timing, a family grew roots in hospital rooms and waiting areas, in shared grief and tentative hope, in the spaces between who they'd been and who they were learning to become. Emily's scans the following week showed the treatment was working. The cancer was retreating. Against all probability, they were winning. May arrived with cherry blossoms and sentencing day. Richard stood before the judge in a federal courtroom, his expensive suit unable to disguise the weight he'd lost, or the gray that had overtaken his hair. The prosecutor recommended 3 years. Richard's lawyer argued for probation. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen countless white-collar criminals pass through her courtroom, studied Richard with penetrating eyes. Mr. Wallace, you've built an empire on ambition and ruthlessness. You've hurt people, investors who trusted you, employees who depended on you. The law demands accountability. She paused. However, I've read the letters submitted on your behalf, from a hospital social worker, from oncology nurses, from a 9-year-old girl who calls you grandpa and wants you at her birthday party in July. Jessica sat in the gallery, her hand pressed to her mouth. Beside her, Mrs. Chen squeezed her other hand tight. I'm sentencing you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised release and 300 hours of community service. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I hope you use this time to continue becoming the man your granddaughter believes you are. Court dismissed. Richard turned and found Jessica in the crowd. Their eyes met across the courtroom and he mouthed 2 words. Thank you. He was allowed 1 week before reporting to prison, 7 days to settle his affairs and say goodbye. He spent 6 of them in Baltimore. On the final evening before his surrender, Richard took Jessica and Emily to dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the harbor. Emily wore a new wig, shoulder-length brown hair that made her look older, more like the healthy 10-year-old she was becoming. Her appetite had returned, her color improved. Dr. Morrison had used the word remission at their last appointment, cautiously but genuinely. So, Grandpa goes to timeout for grown-ups? Emily asked, twirling spaghetti on her fork with the seriousness of someone trying to understand adult complications. Richard laughed, a real laugh that Jessica had learned to recognize as rare and precious. That's exactly what it is, sweetheart. Time out for making bad choices. Will they be mean to you there? No, honey. It's not like in the movies. It'll be boring more than anything else. Lots of time to think. He reached across the table and took her small hand. But I'll write you letters every week, and I'll call whenever I'm allowed. And before you know it, I'll be back. Promise? I promise. Emily nodded, satisfied with this arrangement in the way only children can be, already mentally moving on to her pasta. But Jessica saw the fear Richard carried, not of prison, but of losing the connection he'd only just found. After dinner, they walked along the harbor. Emily ran ahead, chasing seagulls with energy that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Jessica and Richard followed at a distance. I've been thinking, Richard said, watching his granddaughter's silhouette against the setting sun, about what happens after. I'll have some money left when I get out. Not much by my old standards, but enough. I thought maybe I could help you go back to school, finish your degree. You mentioned once that you'd started college but had to drop out when Emily was born. Jessica stopped walking. Richard, let me finish. He turned to face her. I can't give you back your childhood. I can't undo 34 years of absence. But maybe I can help you build the future you deserve. Not as charity, as something a father does for his daughter. Tears blurred Jessica's vision. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Richard's voice gentled. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Let someone take care of you for once. They stood on the harbor walk, the water lapping at the dock, the city lights beginning to glow. Emily returned, breathless and happy, and Richard lifted her onto his shoulders, something he'd learned to do in recent months, this physical affection that had once been so foreign to him. Look, Mama, I'm taller than everyone. Jessica watched her father carry her daughter and felt the last of her armor crack open. Okay, she said softly. Richard looked at her questioningly. I'll think about it. About school. About the future. Jessica smiled through her tears. About letting you be my father. That's all I can ask. The next morning, Jessica and Emily drove Richard to the federal prison in Cumberland, Maryland. The facility looked less menacing than Jessica had feared, more like a college campus than the fortress she'd imagined. They sat in the parking lot, none of them ready for goodbye. 18 months, Richard said, more to himself than them. I can do 18 months. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed into the front seat, wrapping her arms around Richard's neck. I'll write you every week too, Grandpa. And I'll tell you about school and my friends and the stars. I'd like that very much, sweetheart. Richard held her tight, his eyes squeezed shut. Be good for your mama. And keep fighting. You're the strongest person I know. Stronger than you. So much stronger than me. When Emily climbed back to her seat, Richard turned to Jessica. For a moment, they just looked at each other, father and daughter, strangers who'd become family in the crucible of crisis. Take care of her, Richard said. Always. And take care of yourself. I'll try. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is for you. Don't open it until you get home. Jessica took it, feeling the weight of something more than paper inside. What is it? A story. One I should have told you a long time ago. He smiled sadly. Better late than never, right? They watched him walk toward the prison entrance, his shoulders straight despite the weight he carried. At the door, he turned back and waved. Emily pressed her face against the window, waving back furiously, and then he was gone, swallowed by concrete and consequence. On the drive back to Baltimore, Emily fell asleep in the back seat. Jessica waited until they were safely parked at their hotel before opening the envelope. Inside was a letter, pages and pages in Richard's precise handwriting, telling the story of a young man who'd loved a woman named Catherine, who'd been too afraid to choose love over ambition, who'd spent 30 years building an empire on the foundation of his greatest regret, and at the end, a confession. Meeting you and Emily didn't redeem me, but it reminded me that redemption is possible, that people can change, even when they don't deserve second chances. You gave me that chance, Jessica. You let me be a grandfather before I'd earned the right to be a father. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that gift. I love you. I should have said it sooner, said it more, but I'm still learning this language of family. I love you, daughter, and I'm so incredibly proud of who you've become, not because of me, but despite me. Thank you for letting me be part of your story, even though I missed so much of it. Thank you for teaching me that wealth isn't measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the people who wait for you to come home. I'll see you in 18 months. Until then, know that I'm thinking of you both, every single day. Your father, Richard. Jessica folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. In the back seat, Emily stirred, murmuring something about stars in her sleep, and Jessica sat in that parking lot, crying and healing in equal measure, mourning the father she'd never had while celebrating the one she'd found, imperfect, flawed, trying, and finally present. 18 months felt like both forever and an instant. Jessica marked time in milestones. Emily's 10th birthday celebrated with remission confirmed. The first day of community college where Jessica, at 31, sat among students who could have been her younger siblings. The bi-weekly calls from Cumberland, where Richard's voice grew softer, more human. The letters that arrived like clockwork, stories of his childhood, apologies for his absence, questions about their lives that proved he was finally learning to listen. Emily kept every letter in a decorated shoebox, reading them before bed like precious texts. She wrote back religiously, filling pages with crayon drawings of constellations and stories about school. Mama got an A on her biology test, I'm so proud of her, Grandpa. You would be too. The Bronx apartment felt different now. Still small, still shabby, but no longer suffocating. Jessica had quit 2 of her 3 jobs, kept the morning diner shift while attending afternoon classes. The medical trust covered Emily's ongoing care. For the first time in her adult life, Jessica could breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. Summer arrived, then fall, then winter again. Emily thrived, her hair growing back darker and thicker, her energy boundless, her future stretching before her like an open road. She joined the school astronomy club and talked endlessly about planets and galaxies. The telescope Richard had given her stayed by her window, pointed at whatever stars could pierce through the Bronx's light pollution. In November, Jessica graduated from her paralegal certification program. Emily sat in the audience wearing a dress they'd picked out together, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers. When Jessica's name was called, her daughter stood and cheered with unrestrained joy. The photograph they took that day, Jessica in her cap and gown, Emily beside her with gap-toothed pride, was sent to Cumberland in the next letter. Richard called 3 days later, tears in his voice. I'm so proud of you, both of you. December brought the letter they'd been waiting for. Richard's release date, January 15th. Emily could barely contain her excitement. She made a welcome home banner with Mrs. Chen's help, covering it with stars and planets and the words, "Welcome home, Grandpa," in glitter that got everywhere. January 15th arrived gray and cold. Jessica and Emily took the bus to Port Authority where Richard would arrive from Maryland. Emily wore her best dress and clutched the telescope. Jessica's hands shook as she held the banner. The bus pulled in at 2:47 p.m. Passengers disembarked slowly. And then, there he was. Richard looked older, thinner, his expensive suits replaced by simple jeans and a worn jacket. But his eyes, when they found Jessica and Emily in the crowd, held something they'd never contained before. Peace. "Grandpa!" Emily broke free and ran, launching into Richard's arms. He caught her, stumbling slightly, and buried his face in her hair. His shoulders shook with sobs he didn't try to hide. "Hi, sweetheart. God, I missed you." Jessica approached slowly, and Richard's hand reached for her. She took it, and suddenly they were a circle, 3 people connected by blood and choice, by failure and forgiveness. "Thank you," Richard whispered. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for trying." Jessica replied, "That's all we ever needed." They took the subway back to the Bronx, Richard's first time on public transportation in decades. Emily sat on his lap, pointing out sights through the dirty windows, and he smiled like a man who'd finally come home. The apartment party was small and imperfect. Mrs. Chen's empanadas, the crooked banner, Emily's lopsided cake. But when they sang, off-key and enthusiastic, Richard wept openly, surrounded by people who loved him not for his wealth but for his willingness to show up. Later, after the guests had left and Emily had fallen asleep, Jessica and Richard sat on the fire escape looking at the stars. "I got a job," Richard said. "Assistant manager at a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated people find employment." His smile was genuine. "I also found an apartment nearby, walking distance, so I can be here for dinner, for homework help, for whatever you need." "That's perfect," Jessica said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their breath mist in the cold air. "I keep thinking about Catherine," Richard said, "about what she'd say if she could see us now." Jessica thought about the mother she'd never known. "I think she'd say we did okay, that we found each other despite everything. We found family," Richard said. "The real kind, not the one you're born into, but the one you choose every single day." Inside, Emily called for water. Richard started to rise. "Let me." Jessica watched through the window as her father sat beside her daughter's bed and told her a story about stars and second chances and the long journey home. The city hummed around them, indifferent and eternal. But in this small apartment in the Bronx, something precious had taken root. Not perfection, not the erasure of past pain, but presence, forgiveness, the messy, beautiful work of becoming a family. They'd been lost in their separate orbits for 34 years. But somehow, against all probability, they'd found their way back to each other. 3 broken people becoming whole, not through grand gestures, but through the simple revolutionary act of showing up, day after day, moment by moment, together. And in the morning, they would wake to coffee and breakfast and the ordinary miracles of another day. Richard would walk Emily to school. Jessica would go to her new job at a legal aid clinic. They would navigate the complicated terrain of being a family. But tonight, under the stars, they were simply three people who'd learned that it's never too late to come home, that love, when finally let in, can redeem even the coldest of hearts, and that the people we overlook, the ones we never truly see, might be carrying the very thing we've been searching for all along: family, forgiveness, home, the end. Did you like this story? Would you have done anything differently? Tell me in the comments. See you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe now to receive more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Thank you very much.